This is The Daily Divide. New Zealand's government is under scrutiny for its claims of being on track to meet climate targets. Simon Upton, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, criticised the government's draft emissions reduction plan, expressing doubts over its effectiveness. Upton argues that the government is overly reliant on carbon pricing and planting pine trees to offset emissions instead of making substantial cuts. He warned that this approach is a massive gamble, especially since the calculations assume speculative technologies will help meet targets. Upton is sceptical that the country will meet its first and second emissions budgets and believes the third will likely be missed, despite optimistic projections. He also criticised the government's least cost approach to tackling climate change, stating it only considers short-term costs and neglects broader environmental and economic impacts, such as health benefits from cleaner air. Upton also questioned the reliance on the Emission Trading Scheme, or ETS, pointing out its limitations and over-reliance on forestry offsets, which he says could have long-term negative consequences. In transport, Upton noted that carbon pricing alone is unlikely to drive significant emission reductions, citing studies that the transport sector is largely unresponsive to carbon price increases. Upton's submission raises serious concerns about whether the government's current strategy is sufficient to address the current climate crisis effectively. Australia has introduced a new right to disconnect law, giving millions of workers the legal right to ignore work-related communications after hours without fear of retaliation. This law allows employees to refuse to monitor, read, or respond to their boss outside of work hours unless there's a legitimate work emergency. Violations could lead to fines up to 19,000 Australian dollars. The law aims to improve work-life balance and reduce burnout, but it's not without its challenges. The ambiguity around what constitutes as reasonable contact has raised concerns about how the law will be enforced, despite the positive intentions. Experts like Brent Ferguson from the Australian Industry Group warn that the practicality of the law remains uncertain. As New Zealand watches from across the Tasman, there's debate on whether a similar law could work here. While some see the benefits, the Employers and Manufacturers Union, EMA, argues that the existing protections already cover issues like after-hours emails, making such a law unnecessary and difficult to implement. A similar law introduced in France faced significant challenges and was often ignored by businesses. In New Zealand, employment law experts note that workers can already set boundaries around their work hours, with legal protections in place to ensure compensation for any required availability. While the new Australian law is seen as a positive step for workers' rights, its effectiveness will depend on how well it can be enforced and whether it truly benefits employees. Outgoing Treasury Chief Dr. Carly McLeish is calling for major changes to ensure New Zealand's financial sustainability. McLeish emphasised that the government's current approach of trimming spending won't suffice. Instead, she advocates for structural reforms, including a capital gains tax and a more efficient superannuation system. McLeish points to New Zealand's growing debt, which has surged due to the pandemic, Cyclone Gabrielle, and other recent crises, which has resulted in a $7.7 billion deficit and a net core crown debt at 43% of GDP. She warns without new revenue streams and spending cuts, the country's debt trajectory will continue to rise. A capital gains tax, though unpopular with current political leaders like Finance Minister Nicola Willis, is something McLeish and international organisations like the IMF and OECD see as a critical gap in New Zealand's tax system. She also suggests reforming New Zealand's superannuation system, as an ageing population means more government funds are going to wealthier retirees. However, she acknowledges that changes like raising the eligibility age would be politically and administratively challenging. McLeish also touches on the idea of asset recycling, where the government could consider selling off state assets to pay down debt, though this is not currently on the government's agenda. She emphasises that while state ownership of commercial entities is high, reviewing these assets could be a future option. Reflecting on her tenure, McLeish is proud of the Treasury's agile response to crises, but admitted that some COVID-19 policies were not as temporary or targeted as needed, contributing to ongoing economic challenges like inflation. The Pacific Islands Forum, or PIF Summit in Tonga, wrapped up with key discussions on regional security and the growing influence of China. The forum, which included leaders from Australia, New Zealand and 16 Pacific nations, endorsed an Australian-funded Pacific Policing Initiative, though details on implementation remain pending. The summit took a dramatic turn when a reference to Taiwan was mysteriously removed from a final communique, sparking concerns over China's influence. China's special envoy labelled the inclusion of Taiwan a mistake, leading to speculation over Beijing's sway over the forum's decisions. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon defended Taiwan's participation, emphasising that all forum members should respect the collective views of the group, even as the Solomon Islands, set to host next year, remains closely aligned with China. The removal of Taiwan's mention has raised questions about regional unity and China's role in shaping the forum's agenda. The latest attempts to fix New Zealand's problematic Holidays Act has hit more delays. The current law has led to underpayments of billions of dollars to hundreds of thousands of workers across both public and private sectors. A new law was expected 2 years ago, but the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MBIE, has had to restart the process with fresh consultations. MBIE is now a month behind selecting who to consult on the draft bill. The government has outlined some desired changes, like simpler leave calculations, but the delay complicates matters for companies needing to update their payroll system. Health New Zealand, for example, has diverted $25 million from crucial digital upgrades to maintain its aging payroll system. Law firm Anderson Lloyd noted that the significant uncertainty remains.